I just recorded this entire first segment using my webcam microphone instead of the good one that I bought. So let's go over this quickly now as I start this giant process of making another boss. Making another boss is always a huge endeavor. Well, maybe not always huge, but it is in the case of my game where I try to make it exciting and eventful and unique from all of the other basic enemies in the game. Because, like what are we doing here? It's a 3D platformer that you're exploring around the place, and you're just fighting glorified like Goombas and auto turrets, dodging projectiles. Like, the exciting part is when you get locked into a room and you have to fight a super strong version that really tests your skills and will really kill you repeatedly. That's the way that I see it anyways. So this is the boss for the 6th level. I have made 5 bosses so far, so there's some structure to this process. But as a creative person, there's also kind of no structure whatsoever. Here's what we're starting with though. The boss is this lovely lady, Koro, the Fire Sorceress, who's conceptually existed for Imorah for a very long time. If I can find it, here's her original concept art, and then there's a long series of concept art of her design changing over time. And then, if it's done by now, here is the concept art for how she's going to appear in-game. And the basic idea is she's crazy and likes burning people alive. She thinks it's a blessing for people to burn to death because of the fire goddess. Very cool, very messed up. Probably not that original, but it's fine. And here are the sketches that I have for how the boss fight is going to go. Have the design of the arena in mind and have a long list of attacks in mind. Most of them just being firing fire at the player and rising lava levels, maybe self-destructing, which I'll have some interesting coding complications with that with how explosions are currently implemented into the game. And hopefully just designing a boss that moves very elegantly. The whole idea is that she's going to gracefully dance around. That like you almost want to you almost want her to burn you to death because it's so pretty. And it's just like, oh yeah, this seems right. So that is the starting point that we have. The goals for now are to get some preliminary animations in and some preliminary code, and most importantly, set up what the arena is going to look like, because the level design for the level isn't actually done yet. I'm kind of jumping the gun on this boss a bit, but that's the fun part to make, so I'm starting on it. And you all get to hear about it in this log so far. So hopefully, this is all in past tense. Here's the progress that I've made now. It has been 2 months now. Thankfully, there's so much progress to report. First of all, the actual second half of the fire level is more or less complete, barring adjustments to playtesting and placing down random details like grass and mushrooms and extra crates and stuff to fill out the level. Maybe modify some enemy placement, but basically the overall base layout of the level is done, which means the layout of the boss arena is done. Finally decided on the formatting of that. Just a basic platform with lava pools on each side. Lots of space in the air for lots of fancy fire attacks and flying around and fighting the boss. It's gonna be great. So my process for making this boss has been very chaotic, as I discussed in this first little recording, where it's not really one step at a time, it's kind of just every step at a time, brainstorming different attacks while making the art and animations for each of those attacks. And at this point, almost all of the animations are done. Well, I say animations, only 2 of them are really animations, the rest are just single frame keyframes, but it is effective enough, and I hate animating, so that's what we're sticking with. At the moment, there are now 3 different attacks that Koro will use against the player that are fully implemented into the game. I actually started programming things. That was fun. For the first month and a half, I was only making animations. There was no actual boss fight to go along with it. But now there are animations. Koro will spin to summon fireballs around the entire arena. She will fire dash straight towards you with a little fire shield around her, so to speak, that'll hurt you. And lastly, she'll just float in place for a second and fire some very fast directed projectiles at you for a second. Very basic stuff to describe. The current plan is 3 more attacks. That will be 6 total. I think that's comparable to the past boss fights. I might try to think of 1 or 2, we'll see. A lot of the process is also just, as I'm implementing each attack, I'm playtesting the fight and kind of like figuring out the flow of the battle, what would be a cool follow-up for the boss to do after you dodge a certain attack, and when will there be opportunities for the player to actually attack the boss. That's kind of important. Because along with that, I have to account for all of the different methods of attack that the player has. So there kind of needs to be an opportunity for melee attack, for magic spells of different varieties, either be ranged or AoE, and of course just ranged attacks with the player's bow as well. Although, to be honest, all of those, really the main one I focus on is melee attacks. That's the most like difficult to have a timing for, because the player has to have an opportunity to be right there next to the boss to attack them. All the ranged attacks can basically just, the player can shoot it whenever they want, whatever the boss is doing. But the melee attack specifically, there has to be a clearing in all the projectiles being thrown around, and the boss needs to stay not necessarily still, but slow enough or be moving in a direction where the player can clearly predict where they're going to move and where they can hit them. Another fun part with the boss fights, at least the most recent ones that are actual like people that that you can interact with and aren't just mindless monsters like at the start of the game, I get to set up the cutscene before you fight, because it wouldn't make, I guess like I could get away with just having the fight start immediately, but I definitely like having a cutscene beforehand where you banter with them a little bit, see their character, and most importantly, it gives more context to the lore of like the entire level that you're on. If the boss doesn't really say anything, it's not as compelling in my opinion. So I like adding the cutscene at the start, and as I think I talked about with the other boss from level 5, the Bound Shade, adding the cutscene at the very start, doing that before having the rest of the fight completed is like very effective at framing the entire situation and makes it more compelling to work on everything else, you know. Like, and it's very easy to add compared to everything else, because it's literally just me using the cutscene system that I've had in the game for years. Just type up some dialogue and just import it. It's very, very simple. And then just attach the boss enemy object to it, and it's like, alright, when the cutscene's done, make it start attacking. Like, set the camera in place, set up the barriers so the player can't leave, and play the boss music. Very fun stuff. That's basically everything I've worked on in consideration to in regard to the boss anyways. That's everything that I've worked on. Hopefully very soon the boss fight will be done, and then thus the entire fire level, barring of course me going back and adding other stuff, which I always do. But for the main route at the fire level, it should be done soon. Future me, please tell me that I'm right. Thank you. Alright, it has been a very productive final almost 2 weeks of development on this boss fight. Barring like bug fixes, the fight is entirely done. All the animations are implemented. There's a sufficient number of attacks that the boss fight is interesting. To be exact, there are 5 attacks, which is on par with how many the previous boss had. That seems to be the kind of upper limit for the amount of complexity that I have. I always talk about adding as many as possible, and I surely could add more attacks, but none of them would be really distinct enough from the current set. Because once you have like a certain number of melee attacks, the enemy moves a certain way around the map and shoots projectiles in a different direction. Adding new stuff is just going to be the same thing, but maybe it's just a different type of magic that comes out, or they just change their path slightly. With those 5 attacks, not 3 of them have distinct behavior for each one. For example, I'm counting the 3 different projectiles that Koro can fire as one attack type still, because it still follows the same structure and uses the same animation. Which brings me to a big point I wanted to talk about, is that some of the planned attacks were removed. for that very reason that I just talked about, because they were too similar conceptually to other ones that it didn't really make sense to add. That would be attacks using beam weapons, like fire beams specifically. But it's okay that I removed it because I had good planning, because I didn't waste energy making a distinct animation for it. The plan was always just to have a generic ranged attack animation that Korra would use for all of her various ranged attacks. So it didn't matter that I didn't implement all of the plans. I was still able to use everything that I actually created. That's a very important thing with this type of development, or at least like with my art style, because it's not just smaller pixel art that you can iterate on very rapidly. It's much larger resolution. It takes a lot more time to make each frame and everything, which definitely debatable as if that was a good design decision when I started this project. But hey, it's keeping the entire project as my own distinct style. So I think it'll be worth it in the long run. I'm very happy with the results. The animations. I remember at one point I talked about how I wanted the animations to be as good as the boss from level 2, that none of the animations had been very impressive since that point, because that was the windworm that was like flying and writhing around in the air. Then after that we just had floating skulls that just opened their jaws slightly, and then we had the robot guy who just walked around and punched you and shot stuff, and the bound shade, which, while it has more dynamic actions, the entire thing is just a silhouette, so visually it wasn't very interesting, and it didn't animate very much. Korra has actual animations for her idle and her spin. Everything else is just dynamic posing. Probably not going to improve that in the future. As cool as it would be, I have to focus my resources on more than just having the best animations possible. But yeah, the boss fight is done, as well as most everything in the fire level leading up to that fight. There's still a lot of stuff that I have to do before saying it officially done, but the main route through it is in a playable state, I would say. There is an end now with a treasure chest that you get after the boss. I need to add a cutscene to that, so the cutscene reward to the end that'll contextualize things and get you ready for the next level. Need to add the tutorial discussion at the very start of the level. Now that there is a level, I can appropriately write the tutorial dialogue of what the player can expect ahead, and hopefully just a couple extra NPCs and extra stuff to just flesh out the world and everything. Oh, one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which kind of encapsulates the balancing of the boss and the entire level. As I've discussed previously, the new item for the level is the heat shield ring, which, when activated, raises a fire shield that makes the player invulnerable to all forms of fire damage for a certain amount of time, or up to a threshold of a certain amount of damage. Now, the main new use of this is intended for players to be able to venture into lava and find secret passages that way. As kind of like a design side effect, there's the combat benefit of fire immunity as well. So that immediately had two conflicting things. I needed the player to be able to endure enough damage to travel far enough in lava that it was meaningful, and make that not overpowered against fire enemies, because all the enemies in the game just shoot fireballs at you. Or not all of them in the level, I mean. So getting that balance right was difficult, and I think I failed initially until I had some playtesters come in and were able to fight the boss with no issues whatsoever. Playtesting is very important. That is the biggest takeaway from all of my devlogs. That's what that should be, flashing in neon lights and everything. But the solution that I came up with was literally just to treat different types of incoming damage differently. So if the damage was under a certain threshold, like from lava, like a damage over time type attack, it would be treated normally. But if the damage was above a certain threshold, then it would be assumed that it was an enemy attack, and it shouldn't be given this special treatment. It shouldn't be given extra leeway to allow the player to venture inside of lava. So that damage would actually be amplified when it hit the shield in order to deteriorate the shield faster. And of course, I still need more playtesting on it, but that is the current problem, solution, and state of the game at the moment. like all the other levels, it'll probably keep evolving over time. I still need to add side areas, which will act as a way for me to implement ideas that I come up with later. So I'm not punching myself for not thinking of those things earlier. That is like, oh, that would be the perfect puzzle with lava and fire, and I could pair it with some other item from later down the line or earlier or something. So that'll be added eventually. Yeah, it's a lot though. It's a lot. I'm very proud of where we come from though. How far we've come, and just this level has been. I can't remember, like earlier this summer, slightly before the summer. It's been a good several months. We still have a long way to go though, so I'm not slowing down yet. We have 3.5 more levels to go, basically. Debatably 4. Maybe we can round up even more considering everything I'll want to add to past levels that aren't there yet. But that's beyond the scope of this video. That's how I made a boss fight and incorporated it to the level around it, and my thought process of making everything. Coding and art and sound design is hard. I didn't even talk about the sound effects. The boss has sound effects, but that was just me buying a sound pack and dragging the files in. That wasn't as interesting. But yeah, if you sat through this rambling mess, I hope that you got something out of it. I hope it was somewhat interesting. I appreciate your support on the project so much, and I hope that you have an amazing day or night wherever you are in life. Yeah, talk to you guys later.